Now we're going to talk about the experience of slavery in the 19th century. And by the way, if you are interested in details about daily life during slavery, I encourage you to check and see if your library has this two-volume collection from the Gale Library of Daily Life, Slavery in America, edited by Vernon Burton. I wrote 33 of the articles pertaining to a lot of the things that I have talked about here already and will be talking about soon. I also want to turn your attention to this book that's my proudest achievement. It's a novel that I wrote some time back that follows an African American man born into slavery and follows him through the Civil War and the rest of the 19th century. And I used a lot of the research that I did about daily life in slavery as background for this book. Anyway, by the time of the 19th century, one big change that had transpired from the 17th and 18th centuries was that the gang labor system, which had first appeared in the British colonies in the Caribbean and then in South Carolina, that had by the 1800s become the norm. It had supplanted the task labor system, which was the norm in places like Virginia and Maryland, Delaware, and so forth in the colonial period. So with the task labor system, I know I've talked about this before, but I'm going to refresh your memory. That's where if you were a slave, you were given a specific job to do, or maybe a list of things to do during the day, and you did that task or those tasks. And if you finished them, if you worked really hard and finished early, then the rest of the day was yours to do with as you wished. And some people might use that time, well, just to rest or maybe to work in their own garden for the food to supplement what they received as rations, or maybe to trade or even to sell or to practice a musical instrument in hopes of being able to get hired and be able to make a little money on the side, maybe even save up and try to buy yourself. The gang labor system eliminated all of that. Basically, you're assigned to work in a group of people, and the overseer is going to make sure that you are working from the time you get up to the time you go to bed, basically. The overseer and the plantation owner are usually not the same person. On the larger farms and plantations, the overseer is a white guy who has been hired to keep the slaves working. And sometimes, if it's a really big plantation, then he also has assistants that have been hired. And sometimes he has a slave driver to help wield the whip and keep the other slaves working, who is a slave, and that is his slave job to assist the overseer in administering punishment. Now, if you had that job, that's not going to make you popular with the other slaves, obviously. And that brings us to something we haven't really discussed before, and that is sort of the internal hierarchy, the internal social hierarchy of the slave community. Because basically, at least on plantations and large farms, you had two basic kinds of slaves. You had house slaves and field slaves or field hands. House slaves obviously are the people who work in the house, and that could be like here you have several women pictured that are laundresses, the cook, sometimes more than one cook, the maid or maids. For men, the job might also have the job of cook, the job of butler. Field hands, on the other hand, were out working in the fields doing the hard manual labor outside. And sometimes sometimes there could be some divisions as a result of the position of individuals within the hierarchy of the plantation, because not always, but sometimes slaves who worked in the house felt that that gave them an elevated status, and that the field hands were of a lower status. Sometimes among the field hands, there was the feeling that the slaves who worked in the house were way too close to the master and were kind of suck ups, I guess might be the word for it, sellouts. And so there could be some acrimony there. To this day, if you follow politics, particularly racial politics, from time to time you will hear one African American refer to another African American as a house slave, and that is kind of similar to the insult of calling someone an Uncle Tom back in the 1960s. The insinuation is that person is a sellout. That person has sold out his people in order to work closely with the white people in power. And sometimes that was even shown usually that was shown just in people's living accommodations. As you can see, this map of a plantation. This is the Boon Hall Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, and this map is a modern map of that plantation as it is now, where you can go and visit it and get tours. So 1850, they didn't have buses and parking lots and hospitality centers. So bear that in mind. But other than that, this is laid out the way the plantation was laid out, with the big house at the end of this long drive, and you can see a photo of the actual big house. And that's where, of course, the field slaves lived and worked. And then over to the left, the slave cabins, which were very, very rudimentary and were located at a distance from the big house. Now, what I was just talking about, the idea that sometimes there could be some friction, some tension between house slaves and field slaves. That's demonstrated in the movie Django Unchained. If you've seen that, if you have seen it, you will no doubt remember the character played by Samuel L. Jackson, who was the butler of the evil plantation owner played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and he was essentially DiCaprio's assistant in all the evil deeds that he did to the slaves. Now, it's necessary to read between the lines and sometimes take some of this stuff with a grain of salt. The idea that people who worked in the house had an easier life and were somehow sellouts, that's still perpetuated. But think about the reality of it. Okay, so if you were a young woman, a young slave woman, and you were brought to work in the house as a maid or a cook, what that's going to mean is that you are you are in much greater proximity on a daily basis to the white family that owns you, which the bigger the plantation, the less likely there's a lot of contact between the owners and the field hands. What does that mean? That means that if your owner is the kind of person who wants to use their human property the way that Celia's owner in Missouri used her, then you were in a bad spot because you were right there handy to be used in that way. And that's something that frequently happened. Now, think also about the situation of the plantation owner's wife. Okay? Do you think that she, of course, situations vary, but generally speaking, do you think that she approved of her husband using these female African American slaves as um, sex partners whenever he wanted. Well, no. But what could they do about it? What could they do about it? They had no power whatsoever over their husbands. But who did they have power over? They had power over the slaves. So if you were the young woman who was being raped by the master, there's every possibility, every likelihood you were also being abused, even physically abused, by the master's wife who was jealous of you. So that's not as appealing a situation as it initially might have sounded like it would be. All right, some other aspects of slavery. Well, by the way, I just want to say that when I teach this class, sometimes I will either show or give students the option to watch 12 Years a Slave. And frequently, I will, among the books that I assign, is Kyle Baker's graphic novel about Nat Turner, who's been mentioned a couple of times in these lectures, but we haven't talked about specifically yet. And very often, students tell me that they are shocked, that they are very surprised to see just how badly treated slaves were. Perhaps on some level they knew that was the case, but to see it represented drives it home and makes it more real. But sometimes one has to wonder if people really are given an accurate idea of what life was actually like for slaves, which is to say, not that great. Okay, so here is a disturbing picture called The Whipping Post that shows various slaves being punished. Now, the standard type of punishment that you probably associate with plantations is using the whip on someone. And there on the right, you can see the guy there has a quirt, or a little thing for whipping horses. You see the guy over on the left, he has a much larger whip. The guy in the middle, who is beating the person who is suspended from the tree, is not using a whip. He's using a wooden paddle, and that was fairly common. A wooden paddle that's got a bunch of little holes in it. Now, a couple of reasons for the holes. Number one, it's less air resistant, so you can swing it harder and faster, and the impact is harder. But also, the little holes are specifically designed to raise blisters on the person being beaten. And frequently what they would do after they beat someone to the extent that they raised blisters on their skin with these holes in the paddle, they would then break those blisters, you know how painful that is, and rub salt into them. Not for any kind of medicinal thing, just to make it hurt more. That was a common practice. Now, the guy over here on the left who has the whip, he's got an African American woman lying in front of him on her belly. That's a pregnant woman. They would beat pregnant women, but they didn't want to risk harming the child because that could be harming their bottom line profit margin. That child was worth money. So what they would do, and is being demonstrated here, is they would dig a hole in the ground, and the woman would be forced to lie down with her belly in the hole so that the child wasn't being squished while she lay on her belly. And then she would be whipped and beaten and mistreated that way. I mentioned the movie 12 Years a Slave. There's a scene in there, a whipping scene that is just terribly, terribly difficult to sit through because it is extremely realistic. You can see chunks of flesh flying from this poor woman's back. Of course, they didn't do that for real when they were filming it, but you know what I mean. You can see the blood and the chunks of flesh flying. That's what whipping was like. Um, in fact, I like to I like to tell students that it's hard to sit through that scene, and your natural inclination is to look away from it. And I strongly urge people, unless they have PTSD or something from being physically abused, I strongly urge people to keep their eyes on the screen and see it, because I feel like that's been part of our trouble. Part of our problem in America is our tendency to look away from things that are uncomfortable, from things that uh, embarrass us, from things that make us uncomfortable. Um, and if we look away, we know that it's there, but we're not witnessing it. It doesn't make as much an impact. It doesn't register. And it's easier to ignore. It's easier to pretend like those things don't happen. So that's kind of, for me, a metaphor. Watching that scene in that movie is extremely important. Now, this is a very famous picture right here that maybe you've seen before, that demonstrates just how terrible the scarring could be from receiving multiple whippings like this over the course of one's life. Here's another common element of life for slaves in the antebellum United States: the slave auction, being sold and being taken away from your family, which was a fairly common occurrence. In fact, about one out of every three slave marriages ended in one of the spouses being sold and probably never seeing the other one again. 10% of teenage slaves in the U.S. were sold away from their parents before they reached adulthood. And here we can see an ad for a slave auction, 1855, and you can see the descriptions of the job capabilities of some of these people, who are described not as men or women, or male or female, or even boy or girl, but bucks and winches. Remember that term buck was an antebellum term for a male slave. Um, don't think that we're going to get to that in this class, but in the second half of U.S. history, when we talk about dog whistles, we will come back to that word. Also, if we're going to be talking about being sold at auction, the greatest fear that slaves had, the worst thing that could happen, would be to be sold down the river, which was a common expression and a common fear, so common that today, 170 years later, people still use this expression. Although I've noticed that lately, in recent decades, uh, people are more likely now to say throw someone under the bus than to say sell them down the river. But I think that most people know what that phrase means. To be sold down the river means you've been betrayed, just like being thrown under the bus. You have been terribly betrayed. That comes from the fear of your master selling you, auctioning you off to actually in Louisville is where the big auction would be for the Upper South. And then those slaves that were taken to the auction in Louisville, most of them were sold down the river, literally down the Mississippi River, down in Louisiana and Mississippi, in the deep South, where working conditions and living conditions were much, much harsher. So that's where that expression comes from. You've been betrayed, Well, in that case, their master betrayed them by being sold down the river. An even bigger fear than that was the fear of being sold to Cuba, because it was still the case in the 19th century that being sold to Cuba was a virtual death sentence, because there was a big turnover rate and a big mortality rate. They were the same thing for slaves in the Caribbean. So sometimes mothers would frighten their children into behaving by saying that if they misbehaved, the master might sell them to Cuba. Implication being that's going to be the end for them. Now, we talked earlier about slave religion in the sense of traditional religion, spiritual practice that slaves brought with them from West Africa, and how those things kind of merged in some ways with other forms of belief, including Christianity and including American Indian spirituality. Now we're going to talk specifically about Christianity in the 19th century for slaves. Now, sometimes plantation owners would kind of force their slaves to participate in church services so as to save their souls. And other times, it all depended on the individual. Some individuals didn't feel like, some slave owners felt like it was a waste of time to give religion to these what they considered to be inferior people. But even when the slave owners tried to encourage Christianity among their slaves, they had a very different focus than the African American slave preachers had. The slave owners tended to focus on the Old Testament and all the passages that one can find in there about what an angry God is, and about how important it is to be obedient in all things to the smallest detail, or risk the wrath of God. And again, this is demonstrated in 12 Years a Slave. There's a couple of different slave owners that the character goes through. The first one was played by Benedict Cumberbatch, who was kind of a more humane individual, and who had more of a traditional approach to Christianity. And then he winds up being owned by Michael Fassbender, who has a much smaller plantation and much fewer slaves than Benedict Cumberbatch's character, and is extremely abusive to them. And there's a scene with him reading from the Bible and explaining the passages. All of the explanations are, you're slaves and you have to obey my command or go to hell. Now, in the slave churches, and by the way, with all those increasingly strict rules, if a church was held out in the open by slaves, there had to be an overseer, a white person present. Keep an eye on things. Now, sometimes they would meet in secret out in the woods or out in cornfields and worship. But no matter whether their worship was open or more necessarily furtive or secretive, the slave preachers tended to focus more on the New Testament than the Old Testament, and more on the love of God, the love of Jesus and Jesus' sacrifice, and all that stuff that's in there about the early Christians sharing things equally, having a sense of equality. When they did turn to the Old Testament, there were certain themes that came up a lot, including the theme of Moses leading his people out of slavery and into the promised land. So that was a good metaphor for slaves who wanted to see slavery end and to see themselves in the promised land of freedom. There was a part there in the Old Testament called about a holiday called the Jubilee. Every, I think, 49th year. It was 7 sets of 7 years. Every 49th year was the Jubilee year. And in that year, everyone who was a slave was set free. So if you'd gone into debt and had to sell yourself to pay your debt, at the end of, well, I guess if you did that on year 47, you only had to work for a couple of years. But every 49 years, everybody would be free. And even if you had been forced to sell part of the family land, it came back to you on that 49th year, and that was because Israel was a tribal nation, and everything was divided up by tribe. That was a way to make sure that things stayed tribally balanced. But anyway, that idea of a jubilee was very attractive to African American Christians, particularly those who were enslaved, as well as the passages about the Israelites being taken captive by the Babylonians and essentially living in a form of slavery in Babylon. So those things were frequently the subject of sermons because they were all temporary. They all led to God setting his people free. Now, there arose from that Christian tradition in the black church in the South the tradition of singing Jubilee songs or spirituals. So there were work songs that people sang, that slaves sang, just to keep the rhythm of working and make it go by more quickly. But they started to have that type of rhythm and that type of music applied to spiritual songs, which had a very, very deeply, powerfully moving quality to them, to the extent that white audiences after the Civil War would often pay good money to hear African Americans sing these kinds of songs. Now, here I'm going to share with you, I mean, there's several, like a Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, Coming to Carry Me Home. Well, here's one of my favorites. Didn't My Lord Deliver Daniel? I'm going to play an excerpt from this. Actually, I think I'll play an excerpt from two or three, just so you'll get a feel for what I'm talking about. We haven't talked about Abraham Lincoln, and we're not going to for a while yet. But at this particular juncture, I did want to share a couple of quotes from Lincoln that I think are particularly appropriate for this subject. In 1858, Lincoln said, "Those who deny freedom to others deserve it not for themselves, and under a just God cannot long retain it." In 1865, he said, "Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally." Might feel a little bit different. Well, that being said, next we're going to move on to slave resistance in the 19th century.